pregunta buena.
Wayne, let's try you on this one first.
We have no scientific studies. Let's start there. But we do have a good deal of anecdotal evidence that says that organizations that implement ISO 14001 save money. They save money through greater productivity, use of less energy, more efficient use of resources and manpower, and so that at least all of the organizations with whom I've spoken have said, yes, it cost us some money, but yes, the return on investment was less than 2 years. And so I think we really need to look at this management system as we would any other piece of capital equipment. It has a rapid ROI, and it has long-term benefit to the organization.
Jennifer, if I may expand on that question a little bit, are there internal costs associated with external costs? I know you mentioned a dollar amount earlier. Is that dollar amount meant for the payments outside the company? And should management look inside of what it's going to take?
It usually varies. It can be external costs, it can be internal costs. Typically, the way the certification process works is you have an upfront cost associated with certification, but you see the cost-saving benefits after implementation.
Great. We now have a question from the University Automóvil de Guadalajara in Jalisco.
My question is, what is the main difference between the ISO 14000 and the ISO 14001? What are the main factors that we should have into consideration in ISO 14001, and what would be its influence in businesses? And finally, where can we find information about this subject, this specific subject?
Well, I'd like to tackle the last part of the question, if I may. I think the information, if you need more, can be, the questions can be directed to us here at San Diego State University, and we'll make sure that you get additional addresses and additional information on who you can contact, and I'm sure that we'll provide you with a lot of information that you say, don't give us any more. The other questions, if I may, Jennifer, if I could direct it towards you to start off.
Sure. Again, remember that when we refer to ISO 14000, we're really referring to a family of standards or a series of standards. ISO 14001 is a standard that contains specifications for an environmental management system. ISO 14001 is the only standard to which your facility can be certified. 14000 just refers to the whole series of standards.
Okay. Wayne, would you like to add to that?
No, I think Jennifer's covered it very well.
One of the things I'd like to add to it is that when you're looking at ISO to 14000, there is a list provided in the standard there that helps you to relate the 9,000 to the 14,000 elements. I know we have another question, and I lost the communique. Could someone help me, please? Okay, fantastic. Universidad Nacional Automóvil de México and Florida de Estudios Superiores Cuautitlán de Mexico.
Good morning. Jennifer, from your own perspective, could you elaborate on what would be the profile of the auditor, the person certifying?
Yes, actually, I'd be happy to.
Sí, con gusto lo haré.
An auditor, when you are looking to select an auditor for your particular facility, probably the most important aspect of that auditor should be knowledge and cognizance of your business, of your facility. They should know and understand your business culture. And then, of course, there are other auditor qualifications that are going to be important. The ability to be objective as opposed to subjective. Sometimes good negotiation skills can be very important. Interpretation. You may want to get a sense for the auditor's interpretation of the standard before you actually get into the audit itself. It may eventually save you some time. So those are probably the key characteristics, I think, that I would suggest for an auditor.
If I may expand that just a moment, what about registrars? Should they be looking at registrars in the same light as the auditor qualifications?
Absolutely. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, knowing and selecting your registrar is going to be very, very important, and putting some time and effort into choosing a registrar with whom, again, a strong professional business relationship either has been established or can be established is going to be crucial.
Yes. Maybe we should take a second and describe the difference between registrars and auditors. Registrars are the organizations that are empowered by each national group to actually issue a certification. The auditor is that individual, we're talking about the lead auditor essentially, that individual who's going to come to your facility and actually do the work. And so you need to understand the philosophy and of both of those, of both the individual and the organization.
Okay. Great. We have a pause here. Okay. Good. Our next phone call is Instituto Político Nacional, Ciudad de Tijuana, Mexico.
If the ISO 14001 has to do with regulations and these standards change from country to country, how could this lead to a global standardization?
I would like to step in real quick on that. ISO 9000 is not a regulatory requirement. It's a voluntary requirement. Wayne, you were in the area of legal. Is that a fair statement?
It is true. ISO 14001 is a voluntary standard. It does impose on each organization an obligation to know, understand, and meet the legal requirements of its country, its jurisdiction. And so it is true that there may be some variation, but the concept of a standard certifiable management system is common universally.
I always like the term voluntary. As we all know, voluntary is only as voluntary as your customer requires you to do it. But I think you're correct there in that there's really no legal requirement for ISO 9000. How about 14,000? Is there a legal requirement for 14,000?
Again, John, there's no legal requirement for ISO 14000. The attempt here is to establish common levels of practice, common levels of environmental performance from country to country, because we all know that environmental regulations vary from country to country, even city to city within a country. So the attempt is to standardize, establish some common levels of environmental performance.
Well, very good questions. Now let's begin with Module 2, in which our guest, Mr. Wayne Rosenbaum, will introduce to us the legal benefits and the pitfalls of the environmental management system.
Thank you. Before approaching the legal benefits and pitfalls of ISO 14001, it's necessary to have a basic understanding of the standard's origin and potential business impacts. What exactly is ISO 14000? Well, since 1946, the International Organization for Standardization, what we know as ISO, has been developing standards for everything from screw threads to film speeds. However, in 1987, ISO turned its hand to process standards rather than product standards by publishing ISO 9000 standards for quality management and assurance systems. They later adapted the ISO 9000 total quality management concept to the development of the ISO 14000 environmental management series. What is an environmental management system? Well, an environmental management system, as defined by ISO 14001, consists of 5 basic elements. First, a commitment and policy. Second, planning. Third, implementation. Fourth, checking and corrective action. And finally, fifth, management review. The first step in establishing an environmental management system is to establish your organization's environmental policy and assure the organization's commitment to it. While the organization sets its own policy, several key elements must be present in that policy. The organization must commit to comply with all applicable laws and regulations. The organization must commit to pollution prevention. The organization must commit to continual improvement of the environmental management system. And the organization must commit to documenting the implementation, maintenance, and communication of that policy to all employees and the public. The organization must plan, and that plan should include several elements. First, the organization must identify the environmental aspects of its activities, products, or services. Next, the organization must identify the legal requirements and other requirements to which this organization subscribes that are directly applicable to the environmental aspects of its activities, products, or services. Then, the organization must establish goals and targets for each environmental aspect of its activities, products, or services. The organization must identify responsible parties or positions for achieving these objectives and goals. The next phase is implementation. Management must provide the resources necessary to set up and control the environmental management system. Resources to be considered include financial, technical, and human. As for checking and corrective action, the environmental management system must include a self-evaluative feedback process to ensure that this is not just a paper tiger. The required elements of that process include a documented compliance auditing system that tracks performance of relevant operational controls and conformance with the organization's objectives and targets. A procedure for identifying responsibility and authority for investigating and correcting any nonconformances, and a procedure for the identification and maintenance and disposition of environmental records. Finally, the organization must conduct routinely scheduled reviews of the environmental management system. ISO 14001 intends that the reviews address the need for modification to policies, objectives, and other elements of the environmental management system, considering audit results, any changing circumstances, and the organization's commitment to continual environmental improvement. Why is ISO 14001 so important? Well, ISO 14001 is making a big splash in corporate and government waters. This is because it forces companies everywhere to take a close look at how they manage their environmental activities. Although intended to be a voluntary standard, government agencies, including the Department of Energy and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, may make ISO 14001 certification a requirement for their suppliers. Thus, companies that fail to implement ISO 14001 will soon find it difficult to compete in areas such as Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. Market forces, in conjunction with government mandates and the growing pressure of the public groups that urge companies to operate sound environmental practices, will ultimately prod the universal adoption of ISO 14001. However, external forces are not the only force driving ISO 14001. Many companies also recognize the internal need for a sound environmental management system and have encouraged the creation of a common, internationally accepted environmental management system standard. Hoping to thwart duplicative and often competitive nature of government legislation, These corporate leaders are committed to ISO 14001 because it makes their companies more competitive in a global market. For example, Ford Motor Company has committed to registering its U.S. facilities to ISO 14001 by the end of 1998. Simply stated, companies that implement ISO 14001 find that they waste fewer resources, reduce liabilities, improve their public image, and increase profits. How does ISO 14001 fit with ISO 9000? The ISO 9000 series, as revised in 1994, provides organizations with an internationally recognized quality management system. That system is designed to ask and answer two questions. First, what do my customers want? And second, how can the organization design and implement a management system to ensure that customers' demands are consistently met? ISO 9000 does not set quality standards. Rather, it allows the organization to identify and maintain standards required by their customers. ISO 14001 asks and answers two similar management questions. First, what type of environmental performance do the organization's stakeholders desire? And second, how can the organization then implement and design a system that achieves those environmental goals? The significant difference between the standards are the type of standard to be achieved and who defines that standard. While ISO 9000 addresses quality of goods and services, ISO 14000 addresses the organization's environmental aspects and their impacts. The less obvious difference is who defines those standards. ISO 9000 looks to the needs of customers to define quality. ISO 14000 has a much broader view. It includes stakeholders, the organization, its employees, investors, insurers, and even society at large. Thus, an organization developing an ISO 14001 environmental management system must consider a much broader group of demands that include, first, organizational expectations. Second, the expectations of customers and suppliers. Third, applicable environmental laws, regulations, and voluntary standards reflecting the broader demands of society. This demand for accountability to society in general also raises significant legal issues for ISO 14001, which are not presented with the ISO 9000 series. The legal consequences of failing to consistently meet customer quality expectations may well be limited to issues such as breach of contract or, in extreme cases, possibly product liability. The legal implications of failing to consistently meet society's environmental expectations can lead to toxic tort liability and even civil or criminal sanctions for violations of environmental laws and regulations. ISO 14001 has many legal benefits. The primary legal benefit of ISO 14001 is that it acts as a liability shield. By certifying to the international standard, a company has demonstrable proof of its intent to comply with environmental regulations and societal norms. In addition, companies that register to the standard may also experience significant regulatory and criminal protections. I'll now discuss 5 legal benefits of ISO 14001 in detail. First, ISO 14001 acts as a liability and shield for lender, insurer, and investor obligations. Lenders are subject to allegations of negligence, and their borrowers are subject to allegations of misrepresentations when they fail to consider environmental risks involved in making loans. As a result, financial institutions are becoming more sensitive to the environmental risks and their impacts on collateral. It is likely that financial institutions will show a preference for those companies who can demonstrate that they have a disciplined environmental management system by being registered to the ISO 14001 standard. Several financial institutions, such as Deutsche Bank and the World Bank, are already requesting evidence of effective EMSs as part of any major project financing review. Thus, ISO 14001 provides legal protections for both the borrower and the lender. By conducting a third-party audited environmental review, both parties can protect themselves against suits alleging misrepresentation or negligence. Insurance companies are fully aware of the risk to their policies that are created by poor environmental performance of the insured. Companies with sound and effective environmental management systems can show that they pose less risk for the insurance company. This, in turn, creates a negotiating tool for lower premiums. Environmental responsibility has become a core value of the public, and the public includes investors and customers. Institutional investors, such as mutual funds and pension funds, recognize the importance of environmental responsibility to the public and review companies with environmental management systems with higher share prices. Further, a sound environmental management system helps protect the corporation from allegations of investor fraud. The second legal benefit, ISO 14001, is that it helps to shield the organization from contractor liability. The ISO 14001 specification for operational control procedures requires that the company establish procedures related to identified significant environmental aspects of operations and activities involving contractor services. By requiring that contractors be ISO 14001 registered, the company can first reduce the probability of an environmental incident, and then, if an accident occurs, the contractor's independent environmental management system may go far to limit claims of vicarious liability or negligent hiring. Third, ISO 14001 may serve to decrease regulatory and criminal liability. Industry, environmental groups, and regulators are unifying around the theme that regulatory command and control systems have reached a plateau by isolating environmental efforts and by failing to provide a holistic approach. Regulators in several American states are moving to increase regulatory flexibility for the implementation of an EMS such as ISO 14000. There are now about 30 state governments in the United States that have adopted laws granting some immunity to a company that has an acceptable environmental audit program and that reports and corrects its violations. Meanwhile, personnel in the EPA, such as Mary McKeel, director of EPA's Standards Network, sees regulators being transformed from punishing bosses to umpires that intervene only when something goes wrong. Right now, the regulatory requirements are the same for companies that adopt ISO 14001, but several EPA proposals would grant regulatory relief to ISO 14001 registered companies. This relief is in addition to EPA's revised environmental auditing process. On the criminal front, the Department of Justice's policy for environmental criminal prosecutions encourages self-audits for environmental violations. The guidance contains a non-definitive list of factors that will warrant lenient treatment of violation of environmental laws. Among those factors are the existence and scope of a regular, intensive, and comprehensive environmental compliance program. An ISO 14001 system and related audit protocol could qualify a company for leniency. The fourth legal benefit is that civil liability may be decreased with the ISO 14001 system. Imagine that your company has just had an environmental incident in which several neighbors were complaining of trouble breathing or burning eyes. Not only do you have the regulatory agencies to worry about, you may and probably will be subject to a toxic tort suit.